The letter showed up on a Tuesday morning, wedged between a gas bill and a furniture store catalog, and I almost missed it entirely because I was too busy scraping a solid quarter-inch of ice off my windshield before work. January in our neighborhood is no joke. The temperature had been hovering around 12 degrees Fahrenheit for most of the week. The roads looked like a hockey rink somebody forgot to Zamboni, and my driveway had been a constant battle against the kind of snow and ice that makes you genuinely question every life choice that led you to living somewhere with actual winters. So yeah, the last thing on my mind when I grabbed the mail that morning was HOA drama. I should have known better. With Susan Goodwin running the HOA Enforcement Committee, there was always HOA drama. Always. My name is Brian Baker. I've lived in Maple Crest Estates for going on 6 years now, and in those 6 years I have had exactly 43 documented interactions with the HOA that I would classify as unnecessary, frustrating, or outright absurd. I keep a log. I started keeping the log after year 2 when Susan told me my mailbox post was leaning at an unapproved angle and charged me a $15 aesthetic compliance fee. $15 for a mailbox post that was maybe 2 degrees off vertical. I paid it because I didn't have the energy to fight it, and that was the last time I ever just paid something without documenting every single detail first. So there I was, standing in my driveway in the freezing cold, ice scraper in one hand, stack of mail in the other, breath coming out in little clouds, when I finally looked down and saw the HOA letterhead on that envelope. Bold, official-looking, the Maple Crest Estates crest printed right at the top like it was a decree from some minor kingdom. I almost laughed. Almost. I stuffed it in my coat pocket, finished clearing my windshield, carefully backed out of my still slightly icy driveway, and drove to work. I didn't open the letter until my lunch break, sitting in the break room with a cup of coffee that was doing absolutely nothing to warm me up from the inside out. I slid my finger under the flap, pulled out the single folded sheet of paper inside, and read it twice because I genuinely could not believe what it said on the first read. The letter informed me, in Susan Goodwin's particularly pompous formal language, that my contracted snow removal service, Rocky Mountain Plow and Salting LLC, had been observed departing my property at approximately 6:47 a.m. on the morning of January 8th, which was, according to Susan's careful documentation, a full 13 minutes before the HOA-mandated snow removal window had closed at 7:00 a.m. Because of this, I was being assessed an incomplete service compliance fee of $75, payable within 14 days. The letter further stated that the HOA had determined my driveway and walkway had not been brought to the community standard of clear and passable before the service departed, and that this represented a violation of Section 4, subsection C of the Maple Crest Estates Community Standards Manual. I set the letter down on the table and just stared at the wall for a minute. $75, because my snow removal truck left 13 minutes early. Now, I want to be very clear about something before I get into what happened next. I'm not a hothead. I'm really not. I'm a 41-year-old IT project manager who likes craft beer, weekend hikes, and building model trains in my basement. I don't look for conflict. But I have learned, over 6 years of living in Maple Crest Estates and dealing specifically with Susan Goodwin, that the moment you don't push back is the moment she decides you're an easy mark and the nonsense escalates. So my first phone call was not to the HOA office. My first phone call was to Rocky Mountain Plow and Salting. I called Marcus Webb, the owner of the company, a big friendly guy who'd been plowing driveways in our area for over 15 years, and who I'd hired specifically because he was reliable, professional, and thorough. Marcus picked up on the second ring, and when I explained what the HOA letter said, there was a brief silence on his end followed by a very specific kind of laugh that told me he had heard something like this before. "Brian," Marcus said, I have GPS tracking on every single one of my trucks. Every job gets logged with a start time, an end time, a before photo and an after photo. My driver, Danny, was at your property from 6:18 to 6:49 on the morning of January 8th. That's 31 minutes of service. He plowed, he salted, he cleared your front walk, and your driveway was fully cleared. I've got photos with timestamps. I felt the first little spark of something warm in my chest. Not quite satisfaction yet, but definitely the precursor to it. I asked Marcus to send me everything he had, and within about an hour I had an email sitting in my inbox with GPS logs showing Danny's truck on my street at the documented times, along with 4 photos clearly showing my driveway before and after. The after photos showed a completely cleared driveway, salted and ready to go, at 6:49 a.m. Not 6:47 a.m. like Susan had claimed, and more importantly, fully and completely cleared to any reasonable standard a human being could apply to a residential driveway. Now here's the thing about Section 4, Subsection C of the Maple Crest Estates Community Standards Manual. I actually own a copy of that manual. I own 2 copies, actually. One a physical binder I got when I moved in, and one a PDF on my laptop, because I had it scanned a few years back specifically for situations like this. I pulled it up after work that evening, sitting in my living room with the furnace running hard because the temperature had dropped to single digits outside, and I could hear the wind pushing snow against my windows in little gusts that made the glass rattle. I found Section 4, Subsection C, and I read it very carefully. What the section actually said was that homeowners were required to ensure their driveways and primary walkways were cleared and passable within a reasonable time frame following a snowfall event, and that the community standard was considered met when the surfaces in question were free of accumulated snow and treated for ice where applicable. There was absolutely nothing in that section, or in any adjacent section, about a specific window of time during which the snow removal service had to still be physically present on the property. The rule was about the result, not about the timing of when the service truck drove away. There was also nothing in that section, or anywhere else in the manual, about an incomplete service compliance fee. I searched the entire document for that phrase, and it simply did not exist anywhere in the official HOA rules. Susan had invented a fee from thin air. I made a note of that, a very detailed note. The next morning I drove to work in fresh snow because we'd gotten another 2 inches overnight, and by the time I got back home that evening my driveway had been plowed again, because Marcus's crew runs a seasonal contract for me and they handle it automatically whenever accumulation hits 2 inches. The driveway looked great. The walkway was clear. My property was in perfect compliance with every legitimate rule in the Maple Crest Estates Manual. I knew it, and honestly, it almost made me feel smug walking up to my front door. I had 10 days left before the HOA's payment deadline, and I had absolutely no intention of paying that $75. What I did intend to do was build the cleanest, most airtight response I could, because if there's one thing I've learned from years of dealing with Susan Goodwin, it's that you do not fire off an angry email and hope for the best. You document everything, you cite specific language, and you present your case so clearly that there is no room for her to wiggle around it. I spent 2 evenings putting together my response letter. I cited Section 4, Subsection C verbatim, with the specific language highlighted in a clean attachment. I included Marcus's GPS records, the before and after photos with timestamps, and a brief written statement from Marcus confirming the scope and completion of the work performed. I noted, politely but clearly, that my property had been brought to full compliance well before 7:00 a.m., that the fee being assessed referenced a provision that did not appear anywhere in the official community standards document, and that I was formally disputing the charge, and requesting a written explanation of the specific rule that authorized the incomplete service compliance fee, and the page and section number where it could be found in the current Community Standards Manual. I sent it via certified mail and kept a copy of everything. 3 days later, I got a response from Susan, not from the HOA board as a whole, just from Susan, which was itself a little flag. The letter used a lot of formal language and a lot of words, but when I boiled it down to the essentials, what it said was, the fee stood. The enforcement committee had the authority to assess compliance fees at its discretion, and if I didn't pay within the remaining time frame, I would be subject to an additional late payment fee and potential community standards review. There was still absolutely no citation of any specific rule that authorized this fee. I read that letter standing in my kitchen while the coffee maker gurgled behind me and frost crept up the bottom corner of my kitchen window the way it does in really serious cold snaps, and I felt that particular kind of calm that settles over you when you know, with absolute certainty, that you are right and the other person has just overplayed their hand. I picked up the phone and called my neighbor Dave Reyes. Dave lives 3 houses down from me. He's been in Maple Crest Estates for 9 years, and he has an even longer history with Susan Goodwin's enforcement committee antics than I do. Dave is also, by pure professional coincidence, a paralegal at a local firm that handles a lot of real estate and property law cases. Not a lawyer, but a guy who knows enough about HOA governance law in our state to be extremely useful in conversations like the one we were about to have. Dave was over at my house within 20 minutes, bundled up in a heavy parka, because even walking 3 houses down in this weather required serious gear. He came in, took off his boots in the entryway, accepted a cup of coffee, and sat down at my kitchen table. I spread everything out in front of him. The original HOA letter, my response, Susan's reply, Marcus's GPS logs and photos, and the relevant sections of the Community Standards Manual. Dave read through everything carefully and quietly, the way he always does, and then he sat back in his chair and looked at me over his coffee cup. "Okay," he said, "a few things. First, you're right that the fee isn't in the manual. I'm looking at the same manual you have, and that phrase does not exist in there. Second, under the HOA governance laws in this state, an HOA board or enforcement committee cannot assess fees that are not explicitly authorized in the community's recorded governing documents. They can't just make up fees at will. Third, and this is the interesting one, Brian, look at this language here." He tapped Susan's response letter. She says the enforcement committee has authority to assess compliance fees at its discretion, but look at Article 2 of the HOA bylaws. I pulled up the bylaws PDF on my laptop and found Article 2. Dave pointed to a specific paragraph. The paragraph stated that any fee not enumerated in the Community Standards Manual or the annual fee schedule required a full board vote and written notice to the affected homeowner at least 30 days prior to enforcement. No vote had been taken. No 30-day notice had been provided, and the fee was definitely not enumerated in the manual. "So she's not just wrong," I said. "She's procedurally out of bounds." "Completely," Dave said. "This isn't gray area. She made up a fee, applied it without a board vote, and is now doubling down on it in writing. And because she put it in writing, you have a documented record of her doing it." We sat there for a moment and listened to the wind pick up outside. A gust hit the side of the house hard enough to make a sound like a hand slapping a wall. "I want to bring this to the full board," I said. Dave nodded slowly. "I would, and I'd do it publicly at the next board meeting." The next Maple Crest Estates HOA board meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday, which was 9 days away. The payment deadline on my fee notice was in 5 days. I sent a brief letter to the HOA board as a whole, not just to Susan, formally notifying them that I was disputing the fee, that the dispute was pending, and that I would be presenting the matter at the next scheduled board meeting. I also, carefully but clearly, noted in that letter that I had identified potential procedural issues with the fee assessment process and looked forward to resolving the matter at the community level. Susan sent back a terse email within 2 hours, saying the deadline was not suspended by a dispute notice, and the fee would proceed to late status if not paid. I replied with a single sentence politely informing her that under the HOA's own bylaws, Article 5, Section 2, a homeowner's formal dispute notice did suspend enforcement action pending board review. I attached a screenshot of the exact paragraph. She did not reply to that one. Dave told me later she'd been seen at the Greystone coffee shop the following morning, which is where a lot of our neighbors tend to congregate on weekday mornings, looking visibly irritated and talking quietly with Linda Marsh, who is another enforcement committee member and Susan's most reliable ally in HOA matters. Dave said the two of them had been huddled over what looked like a copy of the Community Standards Manual. He said it with the kind of small, satisfied smile that you only get when things are starting to go your way. In the days leading up to the board meeting, I did two things that turned out to be more important than I expected. The first was talking to my neighbors, not in a campaign-style way, not going door to door with a clipboard, just having normal conversations with the people I knew. I mentioned what had happened with the fake fee, the invented rule, the attempt to collect money without board authorization. And what I found out surprised me, though honestly, looking back, it shouldn't have. I wasn't the first, not even close. My neighbor on the north side, Paula Hendricks, told me she'd received a similar letter the previous winter about her Christmas lights supposedly violating an illumination standard, and she'd paid the $40 fee without checking whether the rule actually existed because she hadn't wanted the hassle. Her lights were standard residential LED string lights, nothing remotely extreme. She'd never questioned it. 3 houses up on the opposite side of the street, a guy named Tom Burnett told me he'd been charged a $25 fee for having his recycling bin visible from the street on a non-recycling day, which had apparently been a windy day when the bin had blown slightly past the edge of his fence. Tom had paid it too, figuring it was easier than fighting. And then there was elderly Mrs. Kowalski at the end of the block, who had been charged $50 for having a non-approved exterior color element on her home, which had turned out to be a small potted plant on her front porch that had a red ceramic planter. Mrs. Kowalski had been a widow for 2 years, was living on a fixed income, and had paid that fee without saying a word to anyone because she hadn't wanted to cause trouble. Every single one of those fees shared the same basic characteristics. They were modest enough amounts that people generally just paid them rather than fighting. None of them appeared anywhere in the Community Standards Manual, and every single one of them had come through Susan Goodwin's enforcement committee. I started making a list. Then I asked Dave to help me do a more formal tally. We spent a Saturday afternoon, a bitterly cold Saturday where, even with the furnace cranked all the way up, I had to wear a sweatshirt inside, and the windows were running with condensation from the temperature differential, going through what we could piece together just from talking to people in the neighborhood. We identified at least 9 separate instances over approximately 2 years of fees being collected from homeowners that had no basis in the HOA's governing documents. The amounts individually were not huge. $40 here, $25 there, $75 for me, $50 for Mrs. Kowalski. But when you added them up across 9 documented cases, you were looking at somewhere in the range of $400 to $500. And those were just the cases we knew about from word of mouth. There could easily be more. Dave looked at me very carefully when we finished the tally. "Brian," he said, "this isn't just an unauthorized fee anymore. If she's been collecting money from homeowners under false pretenses, money that was never voted on, never authorized, never deposited into the community account through proper process, that's potentially something a lot more serious." I asked him what he meant exactly. He said the word slowly and clearly: fraud. I sat with that for a moment. I want to be fair. I didn't know for certain where the money was going. It was possible, though unlikely, that Susan had simply been overzealous in enforcement and had deposited every cent into the proper HOA accounts through some informal process. But the fact that none of these fees appeared in the HOA's official assessment records, which Dave had access to because he'd served on the finance subcommittee 2 years prior and still had contacts on it, was very concerning. He made a quiet phone call to a current finance committee member named Ray Alcott, who confirmed that the HOA's formal fee collection records did not show any of the specific amounts we were tracking, at least not under any identifiable category that would correspond to these enforcement actions. The money, as far as anyone could tell, was not going into the community fund. I want to be clear that we were not jumping to conclusions. We were documenting what we observed and what we could verify, and we were going to present it to the full board and let them sort it out with their own processes. But I also called the non-emergency line for our local police department that weekend and spoke with an officer named Sergeant Tolles, who was extremely helpful and patient, and who told me that if we had documented evidence of funds being collected from community members under false pretenses, and those funds were not being properly accounted for, that could constitute fraud or theft, and that I should gather everything I had and come speak with him in person. I made an appointment for the day after the board meeting. The night before the board meeting, I sat at my kitchen table and organized everything into a clean binder: Marcus's GPS logs and photos, the HOA letter asserting the fake fee, Susan's follow-up letter, my responses, the manual with Section 4, Subsection C and the absence of any incomplete service compliance fee, the bylaw language about board votes and notice requirements, the list of 9 other homeowners with similar experiences, each with their names, dates, amounts, and brief descriptions of what they'd been charged for, Ray Alcott's informal confirmation about the fee records, a timeline. It was a good binder. It was, if I'm being honest, a binder I was moderately proud of. The board meeting was held in the Maplecrest Estates Community Center, a building that on cold winter nights always takes about 20 minutes to fully warm up after the heat gets turned on, so the first part of the meeting was always conducted with people still in their coats. There were 6 HOA board members, Susan being one of them in her capacity as enforcement committee chair, and they sat at a long folding table at the front of the room. Normally, board meetings attracted maybe 8 or 10 residents at most. This particular meeting had 32. I know it was 32 because I counted while people were filing in. Word had gotten around. Dave had talked to people. Paula had talked to people. Tom Burnett had sent a message in the neighborhood group chat that was less specific but definitely suggested something interesting was going to happen at the meeting. The room was warm by the time everyone was seated, which was good, because the community center heating system was fighting hard against the -8 degrees that had settled over us by 7 p.m. Susan sat at the board table in her usual position, which was slightly turned to face the room at an angle that somehow communicated authority, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a blazer over a turtleneck, with a notepad in front of her and a pen she kept clicking with her thumb. She looked at the room full of residents with a very brief flash of something that might have been surprise before her expression settled into its practiced neutral authority face. The board president, a reasonable man named Gerald Frost, opened the meeting, covered 2 routine agenda items, and then opened the floor for homeowner concerns. I raised my hand before anyone else and Gerald called on me. I stood up, introduced myself for the record, and walked through the situation calmly and methodically. I described receiving the fee notice. I described checking the community standards manual and finding no such fee enumerated there. I described the GPS documentation from my snow removal company showing the work had been completed fully and correctly. I described the bylaw requirement for board votes and advance notice before any unenumerated fee could be applied. I cited every specific document and page number. I passed copies of everything up to Gerald and the board, and I also had copies for every resident in the room. I was not angry. I was not loud. I was just very, very organized. Susan started to speak twice during my presentation. Both times Gerald Frost raised a hand and told her there would be time for response after I finished. She clicked her pen harder. When I finished, I said one more thing. I said that in the process of looking into my own situation, I had become aware of what appeared to be a pattern of similar unenumerated fees being collected from other Maple Crest Estates residents, and that I had documented 9 such cases. I put the list on the table. I said I had additional concerns about whether these collected funds had been properly accounted for in the community's financial records, and that I had spoken with a finance committee member who had been unable to locate corresponding entries in the HOA's official records. I said I wanted the board to conduct a full audit of enforcement fee collections over the past 2 years. The room was very quiet. Gerald Frost looked at the papers in front of him, and then looked at Susan with the particular expression of a man who has just realized he has a much larger problem on his hands than he thought he did this morning. Susan set her pen down. She said with admirable composure that enforcement fees were within her committee's scope of authority, that the fees I was describing had been properly assessed, and that she found my characterization of the situation to be an overreach based on a misreading of the community standards. Then Paula Hendricks stood up and said she had paid an unauthorized fee for her Christmas lights and wanted to know where that money went. Tom Burnett stood up and said the same thing about his recycling bin. Then Mrs. Kowalski, who was 73 years old and had been sitting quietly in the second row, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, stood up slowly and said in a very calm voice that she had paid $50 for a red flower pot and she would like her money back. The room erupted in a way that community center rooms in residential neighborhoods very rarely do. It wasn't chaotic or violent. It was just very loud and very sustained, 12 or 15 people all talking at once, comparing notes, asking questions, the general sound of a neighborhood that has just realized it has been taken advantage of and is not happy about it. Gerald Frost called for order twice before he got it. His face was deeply uncomfortable. Linda Marsh, Susan's ally on the board, had gone very still and was staring at her notepad. Gerald turned to Susan and asked her, formally and on the record, to explain the authorization basis for the fees being described by community members and to provide documentation showing where the collected funds had been deposited. Susan said she would need time to compile the relevant documentation. Gerald said he would expect it within 72 hours. The meeting ended 20 minutes later with Gerald announcing a formal board audit of all enforcement fee collections and a suspension of all current enforcement actions pending the audit. Susan left the community center quickly, moving through the crowd without making eye contact, and I noticed that for the first time in my 6 years of dealing with her, she did not stop to talk to anyone on her way out. Dave fell into step beside me in the parking lot, our breath fogging in the night air, the parking lot lights making the fresh snow on the ground glow a faint orange. It was brutally cold and neither of us seemed to care even a little. "How do you feel?" Dave asked. "Like I need to go keep that appointment with Sergeant Tolley's tomorrow," I said. Sergeant Tolley's was a compact, patient man with a methodical approach who listened to everything I had to say, asked very precise follow-up questions, looked through my binder carefully, and asked me to leave him a copy of everything. He said he would be in contact with the HOA board and would likely want to speak with some of the other affected homeowners. He also said he would be looking into the financial records aspect, because if funds had been collected from residents under false authority and not deposited into the community account, that was a matter his department took seriously. I thanked him, went home, made a bowl of soup because it was that kind of cold that seeps into your bones even when you're indoors, and sat by my window watching snow fall again on the street outside. It's actually beautiful, the snow, when you're not worried about who's going to get charged for how it's removed. The audit results came back 11 days later. Gerald Frost called me personally to give me a heads up before the official notification went out. He sounded tired in a way that suggested he hadn't been sleeping great. The audit had identified a total of 14 instances of fees collected from homeowners over the past 22 months that could not be matched to any authorized fee structure in the HOA governing documents, and more critically, could not be found in any HOA account deposit records. The total amount unaccounted for was $680. $680. Not a fortune in the grand scheme of things, but that's not what mattered. What mattered was that it was money taken from neighbors, from an elderly widow on a fixed income, from people who had trusted the process and not questioned it, and it appeared to have gone directly into Susan Goodwin's pocket. Gerald said the board had, by unanimous vote, removed Susan from her position as enforcement committee chair pending the outcome of the police investigation. Linda Marsh had, in an interesting development, provided a voluntary statement to Sergeant Tolley's clarifying that she had not been aware of the financial irregularities and had believed the fees to be legitimate HOA assessments. Whether that was entirely true, I can't say, but it did seem to track with what I knew about Linda, who was a follower more than an instigator. Sergeant Tolley's and his colleagues moved things along with what I can only describe as satisfying efficiency. Susan was formally interviewed. Her personal bank records, obtained through a court order, showed deposits that corresponded to the collected fee amounts. The case was not complicated. She had been writing official-looking HOA letters, collecting money from residents, and depositing it into her own account. Over 22 months, 14 documented victims that they could confirm. She was charged with theft by deception and fraud. The criminal complaint was filed, and Susan Goodwin appeared before a judge looking considerably less composed than she had in any HOA meeting I had ever attended. She was represented by a defense attorney and entered a not guilty plea, but the evidence was clean and overwhelming, and her attorney apparently had a straightforward conversation with the prosecutor's office that resulted in a plea agreement being reached within about 6 weeks. Under the terms of the agreement, Susan pleaded guilty to 1 count of theft by deception, agreed to pay full restitution to all 14 identified victims, and received a suspended sentence with 2 years of supervised probation and community service hours. The restitution covered every fee that had been wrongly collected, including my $75, Mrs. Kowalski's $50, Paula's $40, Tom's $25, and all the others. Gerald Frost presented Mrs. Kowalski her check personally at the February board meeting, and she held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at the room full of neighbors and said, "Thank you," in a way that was quiet enough that you had to be paying attention to hear it, and somehow that was more satisfying than any dramatic moment in the whole proceeding. In the aftermath, the HOA board did something I genuinely did not expect. They reached out to me directly and asked if I would be willing to serve on a newly formed homeowner advocacy committee, whose purpose would be to review all existing HOA policies and fee structures for clarity, accuracy, and alignment with the actual governing documents. Gerald said the board recognized that the situation with Susan had revealed gaps in their oversight and accountability processes, and they wanted to close those gaps. I said yes. Of course I said yes. Dave joined as well, bringing his paralegal expertise to the policy review, and we spent 3 Saturday mornings in late February going through the Community Standards Manual and bylaws with a fine-tooth comb, flagging anything ambiguous, anything that could be misread or exploited, and recommending clearer language. We also recommended, and the board adopted, a new policy requiring that any enforcement fee notice include a specific citation to the exact section and paragraph of the governing documents authorizing the fee, along with instructions for formal dispute procedures written in plain language that any homeowner could understand. The full board also voted to post all fee collections in a monthly transparency report available to all residents on the community website. Nothing hidden, nothing discretionary, every dollar accounted for in public. It was, genuinely, a better HOA after all of it was done. Not a perfect one because HOAs never are, but a more accountable one, a more honest one. One where a middle-aged woman with a fake authority complex couldn't just decide to collect money from her neighbors and pocket it while waving a rule book around as cover. Marcus Webb sent me a thank you card after everything wrapped up, which surprised me because if anything I felt like I owed him one for the documentation that started the whole thing rolling. His card said he'd been worried for years about HOA enforcement committees using timing complaints to squeeze homeowners and implicitly pressure them into paying for additional service runs they didn't need. He said he was glad my situation had worked out, and he was even gladder it had opened up something bigger. I kept that card. It went into the same file folder where I keep the original HOA letter, Susan's follow-up letter, and the response I wrote with every cite and citation. I don't keep it out of bitterness. I keep it as a kind of reference document, a reminder that the rules are there in writing and they exist to protect everyone including the homeowner, and that the first thing you should always do when someone in a position of minor authority tells you that you owe them money is ask them to show you exactly where it says that. Maple Crest Estates got about 4 more inches of snow in early March, one of those late-season storms that makes you think winter has decided to be difficult right up until the last possible moment. Marcus's crew came through at 6:30 in the morning, plowed my driveway, salted it, cleared the walk, and had the truck moving to the next house by 6:57. The driveway was clean, the walkway was clear, and the whole street looked like people actually maintained their properties because they did. No letter arrived that week. No enforcement notice, no invented fee, no official-looking stationery with a nonsense paragraph about incomplete service compliance. Just a quiet winter morning, a clean driveway, and the particular satisfaction that comes from knowing the system is working the way it's supposed to. I made coffee, stood at my kitchen window watching the morning come up over the snow-covered rooftops of Maple Crest Estates, and thought about how strange it is that a 13-minute argument about when a snow plow left my driveway turned into something that actually made the neighborhood better. That's not usually how these things go. Usually the HOA wins because people are tired and busy and don't want the fight. But sometimes, if you happen to have the right documentation and a couple of good neighbors and enough stubbornness to see it through, the story goes a different way. I finished my coffee, rinsed the mug, grabbed my keys, and went out into the cold morning to drive to work on roads that were, for once, actually pretty well cleared. Some days that's enough of a win right there. The next board meeting was in April. Spring was still more of a rumor than a reality when that meeting rolled around. The kind of early April where the snow has mostly melted but there's a gray chill in the air, and the ground is still soft with all the moisture coming out of it. I went to the meeting, sat in the third row, and listened to Gerald run through the agenda in a way that felt genuinely different from how board meetings used to feel. More organized, more transparent. More like a group of people trying to manage a community sensibly, and less like an enforcement operation looking for infractions to monetize. There was one moment at that meeting that I want to describe because it stuck with me. Toward the end of the open comments period, a woman named Corinne Driscoll, who had moved into the neighborhood the previous September and who didn't know the full history, stood up and asked a question about whether there was any flexibility in the fence height standards, because she wanted to put up a garden fence that was an inch taller than the standard listed in the manual. Gerald explained the process calmly. She could submit a variance request, it would be reviewed at the next meeting, and the board would vote on it. He told her the relevant section of the manual. He gave her the form. He thanked her for her question. Nobody invented a fee. Nobody sent a threatening letter. Nobody asserted authority they didn't have. It was almost shockingly normal. Paula Hendricks caught up with me in the parking lot after the meeting. The air was cold, but there was something lighter about it. That early spring cold that feels different from the dead of winter cold because you know it's temporary. She was smiling. "You know," she said, "I paid that Christmas lights fee without even reading the rule. I just assumed they had to be right." "Most people do," I said. "Not anymore," she said, and her smile went a little wider, and then she walked to her car and I walked to mine, and the parking lot lights came on as the sun went all the way down, and somewhere down the street I could hear a neighbor's kid out in the last of the daylight trying to salvage the remains of what might have been a snow fort before the temperature rise finished it off completely. Spring was coming. The snow was going. And Susan Goodwin's incomplete service compliance fee had turned out to be the most expensive mistake she ever made, in ways she absolutely did not plan for when she licked that envelope and stuffed it in my mailbox on a cold January morning. My driveway is clear. My walkway is clear. My account is settled. And the HOA is finally actually doing its job. That's really all I ever wanted. Back in January, when I was standing in my driveway in 12-degree weather scraping ice off my windshield with HOA drama crammed in my coat pocket, I wouldn't have bet on things ending this well. $680 recovered for the neighborhood. A fraudulent enforcement committee chair removed, charged, and held accountable. A more transparent, more honest HOA governance process. And one very satisfying binder full of documentation that I will keep on my shelf indefinitely, because you never know when it might need to come out again. It probably won't, but I'll be ready if it does. Because in Maplecrest Estates, the best defense against someone who wants to make up rules and take your money is always, the actual rules written down on the actual page. And a really good snow removal company that keeps GPS records on all their trucks. Thanks, Marcus.